Okay, everybody, if we could settle. I'm going to try and be slightly less UN-ish and start as close to time as we possibly can. Thank you very much for coming to what I hope will be a really interesting meeting. We've got some experts here, and we have one in Rome in FAO, and I'll come to that in a second. But before I go into the session as a whole, what I'd just like to explain is how we're going to approach this. And the way I'm hoping to approach this is I will do a very short introduction based on the overhead that will go up there at a particular point. There you are. It's magic. And then I'm going to go through asking questions to the four panelists that we have, the three here and Oliver in FAO. And I'll be taking those, Oliver first, and then Vadim, then did I say you first? No. Okay, I'll be Oliver first, not Oliver. Vadim and Oliver third, and then Marisha fourth. And then, after having asked them some questions, we're going to let them make their own presentation for 5 to 10 minutes on what they think about the Nexus. So that's going to be our initial structure, and then after that, we'll be open to questions. And when it comes to questions, we're going to ask people to keep them short to a minute and to put your hand up, and then I'll kind of point to you, and magically your microphone will work, we hope. So we're going to work on that basis. So starting off, my name is Felix Dodds, and I'm the executive director of the Nexus conference with Jamie Bartram, which happened this year in Chapel Hill. We had one in March, and there will be a 2015 Nexus conference, which we hope again will input to the Sustainable Development Goals Open Working Group process as we move into the formal negotiations starting in January. There is a declaration that we brought out for the Nexus 2014 conference, which we fed in not only to the Open Working Group, but also to the thematic discussions on water and energy that the President of the General Assembly had. The next kind of 15 years are going to be tough, and potentially they could form a tsunami of their own. We know climate change is already having an impact. That impact is unpredictable and can accelerate, but we also have a number of other factors that are impacting on the world that we're going to be living in those 15 years. We're seeing a growth, particularly in developing countries such as India and China. That economic growth is having its impact on the use of resources. You have an increase in population that will have its own impact on resource use as well. And you're going to see an increasing urbanization, an urban world. All of these things will have stresses on how we can live in the world. And the slide that you have up there was originally prepared for the 2011 Nexus conference in Germany, and indicates the challenges that we have in water, the need for additional amounts of energy, and of course it will depend on what types of energy that we fill that gap with, because if we fill it with traditional fossil fuel energy, we're just going to accelerate the problem. And we're also going to see an increase in, potential increase in people suffering from hunger. They reckon, this is their estimates, it's produced by the Stockholm Environment Institute for that conference, that we will need an extra 30 to 50% of food and a 40% extra energy by 2030. And that as we're doing that, the gap in water will be between what we have available and what we need, they reckon will be 40%. And that even applies to the United States, where you're seeing, in fact, some of the deep aquifers in the south, they reckon, will be something like 60% used up by 2050. So this is not a challenge that is for developing countries, it's a challenge for the world. And so the Nexus requires integrated thinking, and that integrated thinking has not been something we've been very good at. And in the SDG Open Working Group, you'll see that unfortunately we haven't managed to solidify many, possibly only one Nexus-related target. And so that's challenging. We need to think differently if we're going to change those predictions and make sure that we actually live within the planetary boundaries that we have, but also within a world that looks after everybody and does it in a more sustainable way. So that's my introduction. I think that slide won't stay up for much longer, but it's a very challenging subject and will be, to some extent, the challenge of this generation, how we deal with food, water, and energy for the future. So I'm going to move on to our panelists, and I'm going to introduce each of them and ask them a question. So Olema, thank you for coming. She's a team leader for Stockholm International Water Institute, Vision 2015. She's one of the team leaders for the Stockholm International Water Institute, and she's planning to promote the collaboration among young professionals in water, energy, and the food sector. And during Rio Plus 20, Olema was a policy coordinator in the area of water, and she did this also for the SDGs. She's on the advisory group for the Nexus 2015 conference, and she currently works for IREX, an international development NGO, on public access projects, campaigns aimed at improving governance outcomes for the 2015 agenda. So I guess my question to you is, what are the current policy mechanisms that have actually integrated the Nexus?
There. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. And before I get into the potential policy solutions for the Nexus, I think we need to take a step back and ask why it's inherently that we look at the governance question when we are discussing the Nexus. And in its core, the Nexus is a debate about natural resource scarcity and understanding the trade-off between different economic activities, and that leads you to see that a question about like stakeholders, a question about who comes to the table in these discussions becomes a central part of the solution for the Nexus agenda. And beyond looking at this trade-off, we need to start looking at what are the pressures that are in our systems, which are the current demands that are driving the productive processes in society. The way I like to look at the Nexus is it's a triangle. You need to consider water, energy, and food policies equally. And when we look at a document as the Open Working Group, what we're seeing is a polygon. We're seeing a lot of policy talk, a lot of targets that are related about water efficiency, but we are not seeing as much conversation taking place in the agriculture sector, in the energy sector. And when you are trying to promote an integrated vision at the regional level, at the national level, or even at your basin level, that sort of thinking is not going to promote the overall outcomes that Nexus is seeking to drive. Looking more critically about policy solutions that can be incorporated, I have a couple of examples. The importance of understanding the Nexus is that it can be applied at different levels. There's still an ongoing debate which one of these levels is the most effective when it comes to policy making. So in terms of the national scale, A lot of the discussions are centered about the fact that ministries need to stop taking decisions in a silo. You have your Minister of Water Resources, you have your Ministry of Energy, you have your Ministry of Agriculture. All of them are using the same resources. All of their projects need water, all of their projects are depending on the energy on the energy availability of your country. So why aren't they in the table making decisions together? So countries like Germany, Netherlands are trying to incorporate a model where you have like these three ministries taking decisions at the same time and looking at integrated development plans, which we could all agree that that's common sense to this point, but a lot of countries have still not taken the lead in that area. The other level that we can look for policy solutions for the Nexus is the regional. Water doesn't respect boundaries. Land, it doesn't matter if you are in X or Y country, land is a single unit, and it also doesn't respond to geographic boundaries. So you need to take that into consideration when we're talking about policy solutions, or how do you go about implementing the Nexus, or even how you think about the Nexus within the SDG agenda. What are some of those regional mechanisms that can be applied throughout the world that can promote more efficient use of resources? And some areas that are interesting to look at, we have the MENA regions, countries like Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Tunisia. All of them share similar basins, similar resources, so they lately have been coming to the table together to make decisions about integrated water, land use, and promote that nexus thinking. Other policy options which are still very new at this point, but worth mentioning, the question about labeling. Why don't we look at the end chain, the products that we are producing, and figure out how much water, how much energy, how much land units it takes to make them, and put that information out there. So those are some quick suggestions. I hope to continue engaging more in the debate with the other panelists.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back for each of the panelists to make a 5 to 10 minute more general statement on a set of questions that we had asked them to consider as well. But I wanted to give an opportunity at the beginning to, in a sense, focus the particular panelists down to some areas that they particularly have some interest in. So our second speaker is Vladimir Belikov. He's co-founder and co-chair of the Next Generation Energy Leaders Council, vice chairman of the G8 Young Summit, vice president of the board of the Business Assembly of the G20Y Summit, vice president of the International Youth Diplomacy League, and the CEO of PSD Development Company in real estate in St. Petersburg. So I guess the question to you is relating to the business community and what role they can play. But what role do you think education and knowledge can play in building a Nexus approach?
Thank you, Felix. We know that Nexus resources based on the three columns. It's water, food, and energy. But I think that knowledge and education is a fourth column, and it's very important for achievement our purpose to make the world better. The main idea is that we are living on the same planet, consumer and manufacturers, and we have to think about not only about profits but also about civil society and what's going on the ground, what's going on the in development countries and developing countries. And that's why I think that education is very important, and I think that civil society play a very important role in this case. I think we have to look at this problem complexly, and complex decision is a complex knowledge. And that's why I think that it's very important. I can show you a couple of examples how civil society and governments play together and for achievement of purpose. One of our civil societies, which are based in United States and have a small farm in Mozambique, ask about a good strategy, how to improve situation in Mozambique, what can we do for rising agriculture, because if we're talking about agriculture, we also talk about energy, water, new working places. And we understand that this is a complex problem and we have to involve local governments, business, civil society, and poor people of Mozambique. And we start from education. One of NGO leaders went to Mozambique and started to educate people not how to receive money from United Nations, but how to start to help them on the ground, how to rise the agriculture system. And of course, when you produce something, you have to sell it. And we involved the main retail chain from South Africa to sell its products on their market. And of course, it's a closed circle. When they receive the profit, they create the new working places. This is one example. The second one is we know about infrastructure projects. But I think that new infrastructure projects, it's totally different than a couple of years ago. Now the civil society and NGO leaders look at the new ideas, new technologies, and they present the local government and the governments to look at this and to use it and implement the ideas of smart city in their country. I think it's very important because the new smart city, it's a closed city. It's not only touches the city, but also in rural area. It's a big closed circle because people from rural area produce the food. We touch the food security, and of course their smart city use what they can produce inside the city. They look at the pollution. It's very important now because we're also talking about balance between manufacture and pollution. This is the main idea, to educate people how to find the balance between manufacture and producing and saving ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you. I think be useful to share with all of you here that the Nexus team at University of North Carolina is working with the UN Global Compact to develop a set of Nexus principles to help companies deal with the trade-offs in the context of water, energy and food. And Oliver talked about a number of the governments that are starting to try and set up Nexus units within governments. And so we're hoping over the next year to start to develop policy guidance notes for governments on how to address that really difficult and complex issue of trade-offs. If any of you are interested, one of the leading companies that's actually dealing with the Nexus is SAB Miller, which I think bottles Pepsi and a number of other soft drinks, and I think you probably know them more for the beers than the soft drinks. But if you go to their website and look at Prosper, they have a video about how they as a company see themselves dealing with the issue of having to be a responsible manufacturing company that's producing or using agriculture and lots of water. And it's a really interesting example about how a company is starting to deal with the Nexus. And I think it'll be one which will inform a lot of their competitors. The other issue you mentioned was infrastructure. I mean, on the food issue, and this is leading into Oliver, clearly a lot of food is wasted due to a lack of infrastructure in the context of being able to get it to market in developing countries. So I think that definitely, clearly will be a challenge in the future. Our third speaker is Oliver Dubas. He's works for FAO as their Senior Natural Resource Officer, deals with climate, energy, and tenure division of FAO. He's worked on land use intensification, forest management, institutional aspects of rural development in more than 40 countries in Africa, Asia, South Pacific, Latin America, the Middle East, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. And we're welcoming him from Rome. It's very nice of you to join us. And I'm going to ask you, obviously, a question leading partly from what Oliver was talking about. Agriculture is, you know, such an important water user, with over 70% in many countries going to agriculture production. But it also is an energy provider now with the production of biofuels. And I guess, what do you think can be done to deal with ensuring that the water use within agriculture and energy from the food perspective can be reduced?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to this debate. Well, you restrict your question to water, but I think it's generally more about resource use efficiency, not only water, and trade-offs. And I think, just as an introduction, these are two aspects, in my view, that we now have to add to the three pillars of sustainable development, and also governance, and institutional strength, which is the kind of a fourth pillar. But the fact that we need to use resources more efficiently, and basically you cannot have it all. We will need to reach trade-offs and to address trade-offs, and the Nexus approach actually helps doing that. But I mean, following up on that, I think basically these aspects are so complex. Bioenergy per se is already a very complex topic and multifaceted. If you add other aspects of energy, agriculture, and water production and use, all these are very complex and intertwined. So one major way of approaching these issues is, okay, on the one hand, you can have your modeling studies, global models and studies. But I think basically these kind of set the limits and kind of give you a flavor of what might happen in the future. But certainly they should not be used to derive policies, to develop policies, because by definition they don't describe the reality. All the more when it's about complex aspects. So in FAO we have taken a bit of a different approach, be it for bioenergy and for the Nexus and agriculture and water, in the sense that we start basically from country situations, even sub-country situations, and then we take it from there to kind of make an assessment of what's the situation, what's a sustainable potential for either bioenergy production, agriculture production, or water use that takes into account the other aspects. And this is actually very important, and we have to do it because we have to be ready to support governments and other actors when they ask us for help. And so basically embrace complexity. Don't deny it. Don't come up with oversimplistic solutions because they simply don't apply. There's no silver bullet. We almost think that every situation is different. We've worked quite a lot on bioenergy, including biofuels, and this applies to that, but also to water, energy, food nexus in general. So by and large, that's one key thing to have in mind, is that global models and studies are fine to describe what might be and scenarios, but when it's about policies and implementation, we need to look at the situations according to the context, the stakeholders, and so on, because the solutions are different and the assessment and sustainability assessments are different. That's kind of a broad statement. And then obviously you need to support kind of cross-sectoral work, which is easier said than done. And again, you can come up with this very nice scenario and models, and many companies and institutes come up with, I've got my Nexus model to tell you what might be in 10 years' time in country X, Y, B, with my model X, Y, B. But again, in FAO, we say that's all fine, but I mean, we first need to help governments and practitioners embrace the Nexus complexity from the current situation. And so we've just now completed kind of a document which tries to help in a simple way assess the current Nexus situation, the context, the territorial pressures on water, land, and energy production and use, but also apply the same kind of thinking to projects and interventions. And more importantly, linking, because a project can be good per se, but then against the context, it's different. It depends on the context. The other thing, so try to be very pragmatic and really start from a current situation which we think is a cost-effective way of doing it. The other thing is obviously trying to support cross-sectoral institutional mechanisms, such as cross-ministerial working groups at the government level, but also then reaching out to private sector and civil society. And we've done that in quite a few countries where we were asked to help countries develop kind of, or at least assess what's their potential for sustainable bioenergy development. And the first step almost is to say, well, let's organize a working group that involves all the relevant ministries and reaching out to other actors. I'll just basically stop there for the moment.
Thanks. I mean, I think you can see we're all grappling with that complexity, whether it's FAO or NGOs or governments. And to some extent, it's been a real challenge because we come from particular sectors. I'm more involved in the water sector, and so I kind of think water's the most important thing. People from the energy sector tend to think the energy sector, and of course, agriculture's the most important. I realize that, Oliver, just checking that. We're going to bring it down now to kind of the city rural area. Marisha is the co-founder of Comunitas, the Coalition for Sustainable Cities and Regions in the new UN Development Agenda. It's a coalition that's been very successful in the SDG Open Working Group. She previously served for an organization I helped set up in 2002, the Network for Regional Government for Sustainable Development, and she's the current co-chair of the drafting group for the declaration of the 65th Annual UN DPI NGO Conference, and also a member of the advisory board for the 2015 Nexus Conference. So I brought some friends along. And the thing is that when we actually get down to a local level, local government, subnational government, often you have the same problem with ministries there thinking the energy provision, that the water's for them, or the food provision, the water's for them, or the water people thinking the water's for them. We're all thinking the same water is being used to some extent by those different sectors. They all think they have the first dibs on it. And so I guess my question, because it is a really challenging area, how can an urban sustainable development goal contribute to a Nexus approach in policy making and implementation?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Felix, and thanks very much to the organizers of this roundtable to have me here today, for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to speak to such a packed room in the Trusteeship Council, which is not one of the smallest rooms in this house. So thanks very much for welcoming us. I think that the short answer to your question is that how can it help? How can an urban SDG help? Well, basically, because it's where the nexus becomes real, is when the nexus becomes meaningful to communities. And it's really where, therefore, we can secure what we could call a territorial approach to the nexus, something that is tangible. Why do I say that? I think it's important that I give you some figures and some facts so you understand what is the potential precisely that lies in bringing the nexus to that territorial level, to that local level. Let's think about the following. Let's think about the fact that 30 to 50% urban settlements in developing countries are set in environmentally fragile areas, vulnerable to flooding and climate conditions, and where the quality of housing is poor and basic services, they are most probably lacking. Then we get a really daunting figure. The fact that the absolute number of slum dwellers has increased by 26% since 1990. We also know that cities account for 70% of global energy consumption and global house gas emissions. Actually, 80% for global house gas emissions. We know on top that, well, we've moved from having 10 megacities in 1992 to having 21 megacities around the world in 2010. And actually, out of those 21, 15 are set in developing countries. We also know that by 2050, about 70% of humankind is estimated to be living in urban areas. But we also know that 25 cities in the world account for more than 50% of the world's wealth. And last but not least, which is very important and gives us a lot of hope, that 60% of the area that is expected to be urban in this horizon of 2050 still remains to be built. So with all this as a background, what is a territorial approach to the nexus within the Sustainable Development Goals? It's basically about looking at urbanization as a process, not just looking at the cities, not just looking at the places. And this is not in contradiction with what I've said at the beginning of my intervention, saying that the nexus becomes real at community level. But the importance of having that nexus linked to the urbanization megatrend that we are going to experience in the 21st century is if we look at urbanization as a process, and particularly as a social process. A social process that, by the way, allows us to look at things with a new geographical scale. No longer look at it just from the city angle, just from the urban angle, but from the city region geographical scale, so we can really make particular emphasis on that urban and rural continuum, on that synergetic development between both areas. Where lies this potential in particular? Where lies this nexus potential within an SDG on sustainable cities and human settlements? I could say that it lies in two particular sets of actions around integrated planning and around governance. And as you can see, all fellow speakers, we are repeating the same messages, which at the end means that there's not a lot of rocket science around the nexus. What we are lacking is capacity, and that is obviously also an issue at the subnational and local level. But let me go back to these two blocks, therefore. The two blocks where the nexus could become real at territorial level in an SDG on cities and human settlements, the integrated planning and the governance. On integrated planning, we could think about that synergetic urban and rural development, which is going to be a must, absolutely. We know that 70% of extreme poverty actually is rural. So it's a must to get that synergetic development between the two areas. Then we can also look at land management and urban design and planning, how the two go together and how the two impact on each other. We have the issue of housing and public services, where surely water, energy are essential and they are related to human rights needs. We also have the issue of resilience. Resilience not just of infrastructures, but of communities as well, creating resilient communities. We have the issue of food systems, those city-region food systems that I think touch upon what you were saying earlier on, the fact that the natural resources and how the urban areas are serving the, how the rural areas are serving the urban areas. You can actually feel right now the impact of drafting the declaration of this conference until very late yesterday, so I'm really losing all my articulate language here. Last but not least, there's also an element in integrated planning, which is sustainable consumption and production. That should become extremely real in this goal. Governance, well, it's about what we always call the vertical integration of different levels of government. So getting the national level, the subnational level, and the local level to work synergetically. And I think that Olimar painted it really well, you know, how we create that capacity to work across, say, different ministries, and also, I would say, across different levels of government, as you were hinting at. And there's also, of course, around governance, an element of partnerships. And all this Nexus approach requires strong partnership work, also involving the private sector. And some national and local governments are quite exposed to creating these partnerships. And an SDG on sustainable cities and human settlements will only be materialized as well if we forge new generations of partnerships with communities and with the different sectors, including academia and the private sector. I'm going to leave it there. And then I wanted to say, Felix, you started by saying that we just have a few targets in the final proposed overall framework for SDGs. Well, I think there is hope within the proposed sustainable goal on cities and human settlements. We have quite some hope there for strengthening that Nexus approach to policy making.
Thank you. And I think that would actually have a huge impact in the follow-up to the new development agenda after 2015, if we have something reflected in the urban area. I'm reminded of the success of the first Rio conference in '92, and over 6,000 communities worldwide produced their own local Agenda 21s, working with their local authorities or their subnational governments. And that could be a really huge opportunity to really make a difference in the Nexus approach. So I've asked a question, and now I'm going to go back to each of the presenters and see what they would like to have said had I not asked the question, and add some other thoughts of their own, because I kind of pushed them in a particular direction, and though I don't feel apologetic about that, I think it's only reasonable to ask them each to have perhaps a few moments, maybe up to five, to make their own comments. So, Olimar, do you want to start?
Yes. So one of the points that I wanted to highlight today is that we have spent a lot of time talking about why the Nexus is good, why it makes sense to implement the Nexus. But maybe it's also useful to look at some of the challenges and shortcomings that we have discovered so far while we have been trying to implement the Nexus, particularly in those countries that have taken a more proactive approach. And there is, in the topic about knowledge and capacity, that is a huge part of the Nexus debate, mostly because when you look at African countries, when you look at more developed nations, their first question is, we just recently finished implementing what we call, to some of you are familiar with this language, the integrated water resource management. Why do we have now to move forward and implement this Nexus? Is this another phrasing from developed nations telling us how to use our resources? And the short answer to that is that it's no, it's not the same. It is part of the same transition and the same thinking about how we can become more efficient about the way we use resources. And if you have taken the step forward to implement integrated water management plans, that's the first step. But beyond looking at the water sector, the discussion that we're having now is that water doesn't exist in a silo. You need to look across your economic sectors. So that's step two. And that debate, convincing some people that that's a step that needs to happen, requires a lot of capacity building. And we simply cannot ignore that when we're trying to convince all the member states that are part of the United Nations that they do need to recognize this as a step in the right direction if we want to achieve that world that we want by 2030, which is why we all are here. The second big challenge is that when you look across the board, there are a lot of things that we cannot control. And we have to be realistic about that when we're thinking about the implementation of the Nexus. For example, California, maybe now that we're looking at it, it wasn't a great idea to have a city in the middle of the desert and have a big agricultural production area in the middle of the desert. Like, thinking back, maybe that wasn't a great idea, but there's nothing that we can do now. We have to work with those constraints. So looking from that perspective, how we can be, again, more proactive, how we can work within our constraints. And the Nexus does provide us some guidance into that. And I mean, we need to take that risk to implement it and see whether that actually helps us move forward. At the same time, countries like Israel and the situation that is happening there, there's a huge underlying water, energy debate there. And again, the political challenges and the political circumstances is something that we cannot control. So how can we be more proactive in the way that we use our resources to promote a platform that can potentially help mitigate some of the political circumstances in that area? And third is the question about partnerships is also a challenge. A lot of the innovative thinking when it comes to the Nexus has actually come from the private sector. And some of you that are aware with the discussion of the Open Working Group, the private sector has not fully still been integrated into it. But when you look at Coca-Cola, when you look at Pepsi, water, energy, is what their business is about. They sell you products. They sell you water with flavor. And so most of their profit comes from that. They have spent a lot of time thinking about how they can still make their business profitable. And there's some lessons learned there that governments can apply, but the discussions are still not taking place. And finally, and I know that I'm probably taking too much time, is there's a challenge regarding the data. At this point, the data revolution does need to happen, and it needs to happen within the Nexus. Mostly because we still don't have, we are doing some work regarding understanding what is water governance, what is the Nexus governance, what are those indicators that can help us measure whether or not we are being successful in applying the Nexus, but there still has not been agreement across the board, across different governments, as these are indeed like the indicators that are going to help you achieve that. And the SDGs, this whole post-2015 framework, provide us an opportunity to answer that question.
Thank you. And of course, I think all the panel here would support the idea that we need a framework for corporate reporting to ensure that whatever companies are doing, they have to actually report on their sustainability. This is one of the issues that was reflected in the Rio conference, but didn't get a final agreement on when stock exchanges should actually have their corporations report on their sustainability. This is an issue that will be pushed forward and is actually being led not just by NGOs, but also by companies like Aviva, who are trying to ensure that the information about, particularly about the water, energy, kind of food issues that companies have on their books, that those are reported and we know exactly what they're doing. So we need transparency on those issues as well. I think that we're trying to here address some general questions, and obviously we are to some extent looking at the next year's set of negotiations as the landscape which we're trying to influence. And so, Vadim, what do you think about how we can ensure that we get a Nexus perspective then? You're our industry person.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Felix. We have 5 main questions at this discussion. I think that 2 of them is very close. It's how to integrate resources Nexus, in the post-2050 agenda, and how can the post-2050 agenda promote the equal access to resources, and it means equal access to the energy and equal access to the food. There are a lot of forums, conferences every year where people discuss about how to promote, try to create the recommendation. But I think before we transform our recommendation to the UN resolution, we can't integrate the resources nexus to the next agenda, because who will control the implementation? Who will control the energy companies? Who will control the governments? It's very big issues. We have huge and excellent international institute, United Nations. And I think under the umbrella of United Nations, we have to create a strategic committee where every country can address the questions and ask people from international institutes, the advisors, how can we improve situation in our country in the case of Nexus resources? What better for us? Because we understand it's what is better for Germany, not so good for Ghana or Sudan. We can't use the wind energy in Ghana, but we can use solar panel. And also in India, how can we transfer their oil or gas, but we can put there the small solar panel to charge the phones, because every African countries, if we look at this, most of them don't have access to energy, but all of them have access to new technology, like a phone. Everybody have a phone, not iPhone, but very cheap $1 phone. People communicate with each other, but it's also the tool of education and knowledge, and that's why I think that only in this case we can integrate the Nexus resources to the agenda and control the equal access to the resources for every country.
I think that one of the important things that we need as we start to address the Nexus is some form of technology sharing bank that actually can enable developing countries to have access to how we should address Nexus-related issues. And it is one of the outcomes from the Rio conference that we should be looking at much more technology sharing. And so perhaps that should be part of the outcomes from what we would like to see in 2015. And you brought up the UN, and what we have some very useful interagency groups in the UN. We have UN Water, UN Oceans, UN Energy, which bring together all of the UN agencies and programs that operate on those particular areas. And perhaps what we need to see is a UN nexus, so that the UN can itself integrate in its work, in its development programs, a nexus approach as well. Anyway, Oliver, you're our third person, so would you like to come in with some of your feelings about perhaps the leadership that FAO is starting, as you indicated, to show in the nexus area?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we have to be very cautious with the nexus, in the sense that if we say, you know, everybody must work in a nexus way, it might put some people off. If you say it's very complex, again, it might put some people off. So as I was in line with what I was saying before, you really need to say, yeah, these are the added value to the stuff you've been already doing. Like somebody was mentioning the water management, integrated water management, yeah, but you can do better. But immediately after that, you must come up with ways to support the different stakeholders, government, civil society, NGOs, the other actors, the private sector, with some possible ways to move forward in a nexus way. And this is, again, just to reiterate, what we've been doing is working based on these realities. And so, for example, there's this big issue of the development of sustainable bioenergy, which, okay, it creates a lot of debate, but basically the increase the increase in the use of bioenergy in all its shapes is going to happen. So beyond the debates, we need to make sure that we get these things right. And so, for example, in FAO, we have like a sustainable bioenergy support package that can help governments and the other actors, the private sector and farmer groups and so on, to make sure that it happens in a sustainable way. And it goes from assessing situations to implementing good practices to monitoring situations. On the water, energy, food nexus, I was saying before, we have now like a methodology to assess the situation at the context level and also intervention level, and how these need to be combined. So we also work on something which 10 years ago would have seemed completely foolish, is basically rubbish, because the residues from the agri-food chain are becoming a commodity. And there are a lot of competing uses of these residues. They can be used for soil management, soil fertility, soil protection, animal feed, animal bedding. But more and more people are interested in these residues to produce bioenergy, energy in general, and also biomaterials, the whole issue of this bioeconomy. And so we are now developing again another way to attempt to address the trade-offs between all these uses at farm level. So that's kind of national and local levels. At international level, I think what is happening is interesting. Some interesting things are happening. Felix, you mentioned the Nexus, the UN Nexus. Somehow there's something happening along those lines in the UN Sustainable Energy for All, SE for All, which is an interesting initiative, and it has like 3 goals: more efficiency and more use of renewable energy and access to energy to all by 2030, with some quantitative figures. But interestingly, they are now complementing these goals with links to Nexus, and FAO is leading two things, 3 aspects of their work. One is they have like a global tracking framework to monitor progress, and we are supposed to come up with indicators on energy, food security links, which is easier said than done, because we have statistics on the use of fossil fuels at production stages, but we don't have any statistics on the use of renewable energy, for example, in agri-food chains, or what agri-food chains can produce. So the data issue that somebody was mentioning is absolutely challenging. We also lead, for example, in this initiative, the SE for All initiative, they have major components which they call high impact opportunities. One is on the Nexus. And FAO is co-leading that with Germany, for example, with interesting organizations involved in that: International Renewable Energy Agency, World Bank, USAID, Germany, FAO, REAP, and International Renewable Energy Agency, and others. So, and another one is sustainable bioenergy, for the reason I was saying before. That bioenergy is a very controversial, but it's a very important source of energy. It's currently the most used renewable energy in the world. And so FAO is co-leading a component, an HIO, on sustainable bioenergy with IUCN. So at international level, there are interesting things happening. The Committee on the World Food Security, for example, last year came up with recommendations on biofuels and food security, for example. This is a committee that includes more than 130 countries, and there's a dialogue mechanism with private sector and civil society. The same committee is now currently discussing and negotiating principles for responsible agriculture investments. So there again, somebody was mentioning the role of the private sector. And obviously this is linked to the Nexus, because responsible agriculture investments automatically touches on the energy for and from agriculture, and also on the water related to agriculture. So in a way, it's extremely complex. And to sum up, we must say you must work. We must recommend that people work in a Nexus way, but immediately come up with ways to help them do that. Otherwise, it will be pie in the sky, and people will say, no, yet again another fad, and they will just away from it. Thank you.
Thank you. I would point out for those people who perhaps aren't aware of the Committee on Food Security that it's one of the most advanced examples of how to engage stakeholders in a UN body, and it's well worth reading a little bit more about it if you haven't done. And I would also compliment FAO and IFAD and their own-based agencies on their contributions to the SDG discussion on food, particularly the work they did on the targets and indicators. I thought was possibly the best submission by any of the UN agencies. But we'll move on. Marisha, take us through your perspective a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, being the last speaker is always easy and difficult at the same time. So I wanted to just now go on the practicalities of implementing this Nexus at the territorial level, no, and with a territorial approach. It can happen, it's possible, but it requires a series of things. And I think that, again, you will see a lot of resonance, a lot of echo with what my colleagues have said previously. But there are two big elephants in the room that need to be put here in the center, addressed, and really, you know, get to some action points on them. One is decentralization. That is quite a scary word when we bring it in the context of intergovernmental, multilateral intergovernmental negotiations. And the other one is financial systems. We know to what extent subnational and local authorities are burdened with the implementation of certain aspects that are essential to the well-being of citizens. I repeat it, I will repeat myself, around basic services that are related to human rights, and where the nexus becomes really tangible again: water, sanitation, energy, housing, food. So if we don't really increase and open a real debate and increase the decentralization models that are working out there, and the financial systems that can be adequate and are appropriate for these two levels of government to secure this implementation of the Nexus, we would just be falling really short on what we need to do. Then there are obviously issues about capacity building. And I think that many times we take for granted that if we empower or if we strengthen capacity at the national, the federal level, then that will trickle down. Well, it's not the case. It's not necessarily the case, so it's very important to focus as well on how we create capacity at the subnational and local level for the implementation of this Nexus. Because after all, what we are really needing to go towards, and this is another point, is the scalability and the replicability of these good examples that are happening there. The good news is that we have tools for doing that maybe just need to be empowered and channeled towards the Nexus as well. One of those tools is, for instance, decentralized cooperation. I mean, it's many decades right now of decentralized cooperation initiatives, city to city, region to region, peer learning, peer review systems that really help these levels of government and their communities to get to very specific solutions. The only problem is that they probably have never been looked at from the Nexus lens. But if we assessed some of those experiences, we would probably find that there's a lot of nexus into what they are doing with these decentralized cooperation initiatives. And now, last couple of thoughts on data and indicators. And again, you see the recurrent thoughts that we all share in the panel. We need to really disaggregate data to the subnational and local levels to really make that nexus happen. Because if we keep on using data that are just reliable at the national level, we're not going to really get to make the nexus happen and see and really cross-check if it's really happening on the ground. But also a thought for indicators. Bringing the nexus down to that very level of the indicators. And I think that Oliver maybe already took us there with what he shared with us right now. Bringing that nexus to the indicator level means also moving away from a silo approach to setting indicators to check whether we've gotten there where we wanted to get. I think that we are having right now an absolute window of opportunity to take the goals that are going to be adopted in September 2015, the targets that are going to be there, and then start looking at those indicators and look at them differently. Of course, look at them with a grassroots perspective, have a basket of indicators, not just a set of indicators adopted in the United Nations room that then might not actually be meaningful or give any ideas of what is happening out there in the reality. But also, it's got to be a new way of conceiving these indicators in a relational manner. If we really want to get the Nexus approach, and if we really want to have information on whether that's happening or not on the ground, we're going to have to also create a Nexus on the indicators. That's I think, where I'm going to leave it, Felix, so far.
Just for those people who perhaps don't realize, the indicators that will fit under whatever targets are being discussed won't be negotiated in the window of 2015. The expectation is those will be then developed after the targets have been agreed, and possibly by the UN Commission on Statistics, which will meet in 2016. There was a really good program that UNDP used to run called Capacity 21. I don't know if people remember it after the Rio conference, and maybe they can play a role in addressing the capacity issue by relaunching a Capacity 2030 program as something which could be their contribution to taking forward some of these ideas. And one final thing, Oliver mentioned the International Renewable Energies Agency from Abu Dhabi. If you haven't gone to their website, they're basically, I think, only 3 years old as an international organization, but I think they've got about 130 members now. They will play an increasing role in promoting renewable energy in the future. So we've finished our questions, our comments and whatever. The floor is now open for anyone to ask it, and what I'd ask you to do is just make no longer than 1 minute, and we're going to take 3 people at a time. Yes?
My name is Eileen Riley. I'm with the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and I noticed that the title of this roundtable spoke of water and sanitation, and I haven't heard the word sanitation, I don't think. I want to urge us to keep those coupled together. I think that's very important. I don't know if any of the panelists have a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am from the Philippines, the Earth Savers UNESCO Artists for Peace. I want to follow up on what was discussed on decentralization and your commendable Nexus way, but generally what is absent or just a follow-up, a missing ingredient, is the effective communications, education that can be translating all of your great knowledge into cultural symbols that people understand in the grassroots. And may I suggest that you utilize, I am an artist, we are in the UNESCO realm, and the International Theatre Institute, the community of artists and media people must be a partner in order to simultaneously transmit, translate, make understandable, motivate people to be involved, to participate. And that's generally after the fact. It must be integrated and synergized into your Nexus way. And to wait is really a tragic mistake. It's a tragic flaw. It must be part and parcel. The action of conscientizing, of informing, of involving, because we've worked with people who are handicapped, the vulnerable groups, inclusive growth. They must be part and parcel of bringing them into this knowledge system.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I am Queen Mother Dr. Deloise Blakely, and I'm the Community Mayor of Harlem and the Ambassador of Goodwill to Africa, returning from China talking about adaptable and applied energy. The question that I raised for Nexus is this: how would Nexus integrate its resources with the NGOs and civil society in planning and implementing projects for sustainable development? And I'm very pleased with all of the young people that is a part of Nexus, and I've been involved with your meetings, many of your conferences. How will you engage in terms of sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to return to the panelists and let them they can choose whatever they want to answer. Oliver.
So I'm going to address the question about sanitation. Sanitation is included within like the water, energy, food security nexus conception. It's not explicitly mentioned there, and I think it's because when people were thinking about the branding idea behind this concept, they recognize that you cannot have 1,100 letters. Some people were arguing that it should be the water, sanitation, energy, food security nexus. It should be the water, energy, food, and gender security nexus. But it's there. And a quick example, when you look at cities, one of the big questions when it comes to the implementation of the nexus is about wastewater treatment. How do you deal with slums that are not connected to basic services? That aspect is inherently part of the model of the nexus, even though it's not implicit in the title. So I just wanted to clarify on that, and as well on the question about young people. I am a young person for UN definitions, and one of the big lessons that the water and the energy and the agriculture sector have recognized is that a lot of the work in implementation is going to be done by young professionals. It's going to be done by people that are growing already with these ideas. Integration for us is a second nature. Not being scared of technology is also that it's inherently part of being a young person, and that's only related to the fact that we were born in the information society, and for us, knowledge is, or the way we approach knowledge is more integrated than with previous generations. So they are going to be a very important aspect of how we go on about integrating and about making like the SDGs and the Nexus happen.
I would like to answer on the question of Queen Mother. How to integrate youth generation. Just a month ago, in the same hall, in the same building, was a Nexus Summit, Youth Nexus Summit. And we discussed about the same problem, how to integrate Nexus, how to give the equal access to energy and to food. And the main idea was to explain young generation how can be involved in this movement. It's not the questions to UN or to us how to take every young people in his hand and push him in the society. We have to explain the young generation that now they are thinking about their future. If they will not start to decide this problem right now, after 30 years they will receive zero drinking water. After 30 or 40 years they receive zero of energy resources. I mean the natural energy resources, oil, gas, and and coal. And now they have to think about next energy, new energy, green energy, and understand what they receive after 30 years about their future, because future starts starting right now. And we try to involve the young generation to different organizations like Nexus, G20 Youth, G28 and G20 Youth forums, where we explain people and try to give them a chance to realize the idea. For example, on G20Y summits, we open a mentorship program where we invite young innovators. There they can explain the idea, they explain their projects, and we think how to help them, where can we find the investors. It's very important to put the idea in the head of young generation that they are very important right now, and future depends on them.
Oliver?
Yeah. Just a quick note on the sanitation, the health issues.
Oliver, you've gone quiet. We can't hear you.
Okay, right. Okay, sorry. I would like to address the issue of sanitation and health. In this methodology on assessing the nexus, we include aspects related to that, and also in our field work is the issue of traditional cooking fuels, which is used in many households in developing countries, and is causing many health problems. So this is being addressed both in the field, but also in terms of monitoring progress. And so so that's one thing. Also, in terms of the water, the energy for good quality water is another indicator that we are trying to use more and more and to promote. And so another way is kind of biogas systems in the field, which allow to kind of sanitize manure, for example, in terms of, and that all these are, so both from the field and the monitoring perspective. On the issue of engaging the NGOs, I mean, certainly stakeholder dialogue and inclusiveness is part and parcel of, honestly, all the work we do in general, but in particular in the Nexus. It's a crucial aspect in terms of the process to develop the assessments of the Nexus in the field. So yeah, I mean, we fully agree that we need to involve NGOs, but also the other actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Moshe.
Thanks very much, Felix. Well, I think I'm going to try to address the three, but one, I'm not going to go into detail. Water and sanitation. I did mention sanitation quite a few times, talking about how they link to human rights, and I'm not going to describe anything because Olimar, you did it so well that I have absolutely nothing to add. How sanitation is essential at the local level and for local communities. On the cultural dimension, well, I think if you actually look as well at the submissions, for instance, that the cluster of civil society constituencies submitted to the official working group, you will see that the local authorities major group, as it's called, and others, were very vocal about the importance of a cultural dimension for sustainable development and how is that particularly essential at the local level. And I can tell you that the good news is that there are many countries, many member states of the United Nations who have actually pushed at the very last minute of the negotiations of the Open Working Group to see a specific target related to culture within the proposed Sustainable Development Goal on sustainable cities and human settlements. So that is being really addressed, not just by us, civil society, but actually also by member states. And on integrating youth and the question linked with planning and implementation, integrating youth, I could actually mention education. Maybe one of the things on which the United Nations could focus on is how to integrate the Nexus thinking into the curricula of some universities and some technical training, professional training, so we can really empower the youth and capacitate the youth with that Nexus approach from their studies so then they can implement it. And planning and implementation about all this. I'm just going to read the words of it's a mission from the Global Grassroots Coalition of WIGO, Slam Shark Dwellers International and the Huayuro Commission, because I think it's really good. Some of the words that are there, we could just actually enlarge them and put other constituencies. But basically they are saying that translating sustainable development goals from policy to reality requires substantive institutional shifts and new partnerships. This means increased representation and institutionalized decision and policy-making roles of organized constituencies of people living and working in poverty to plan, implement and monitor development programs that affect their lives. There where we say people working in poverty is essential, of course, but we could also say youth, women, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
Okay, we've got time for one more set of 3 questions, and then they're going to kick us out. So I'm going to go to this side. You, sir.
Thank you. Eric Abbott-Ball, Vice Chair of Peace Build Canada. Paix Durable. So my comments are about the Nexus and being a political space, not just a technical one, specifically related to issues of conflict sensitivity and conflict transformation. So we know the cultivation of the Nexus as a space will take place in part in conflictual environments. It will bring up old conflictual issues. It will generate new conflict issues. And so when we think about the Nexus, we should be mindful of developing conflict-sensitive approaches to doing so that we don't reproduce violence and create new patterns of violence. So essentially what I'd like to do here is simply encourage us to pursue, cultivate, and to make visible good practices of conflict-sensitive development at the nexus of water, sanitation, energy, agriculture, and land use. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hear me? My name is Mohammed from the Fetzer Institute in Michigan. My question is sustainable? Because it's a tight space, keeping resources going for generations. Can we think in terms of flourishing or expanded growth, things like that? Or are we limited to that space of sustainable? Is sustainable?
Okay, final question. Yes, sir.
Hi, yes, my name is Bryant Brownlee, and I'm from Rotary International. One of the things that I'm intrigued about just in general as we're looking at these development goals has generally been the role of the private sector in all of this. And it seems, I was somewhat distressed to hear from Olimar that there's been a sort of reluctance to get involved in these questions, particularly with the Nexus. And that seems that without the role of without a strong participation from the private sector, that all of this is going to be significantly more challenging, because in many parts of the world, it's the private sector that's actually in charge of managing and operating and using the resources, and they're the key, oftentimes, the key to future development. They're the ones that have, in some instances, more resources than governments have, or at least governments think that they have. So I would think that while we're talking as an NGO community about reaching out to governments, that there has to be an equal push to make those connections with the private sector, with the business community as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask, as this will be the last chance for the speakers, if they've got not only an opportunity to quickly answer the questions, but if they have any final remarks as well. Maybe start with you, Marisha.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to be quick because I'm not very sure that if the questions that were raised right now are really, I'm the right person to answer them. But on taking yours, the last one first, private sector reluctancy, well, we have to work on that. And I do insist, I do really believe that at the local and the national level, there's a lot of potential to craft together what I could call like a 2.0 generation of private-public partnerships, because it's very much there where they are linked also to the delivery of services, of basic services once again, So it's there where maybe these levels of government who are really close to citizens can create a new culture of what these private-public partnerships should look like. Mohammed, your question, sustainable. I think that with the backdrop of facts and figures that I painted around what cities mean, planetary boundaries is imperative. There's no other way around it. And actually, my concluding remarks linking to Mohammed's question would be that if we get urbanization right, because it's a mega trend of the 21st century, and because the SDGs and the post-2015 development agenda should be precisely about that transformative agenda towards human development, if we get that sustainable urbanization to exist and to happen, we can really get extraordinarily far away, not just for the people living in urban areas, but actually also for the people living in rural areas, because that urban and rural synergetic development is going to be as compulsory as ever, because actually urban areas cannot exist and subsist without all the natural resources, all the flows, all the remittances that actually come from the urban places, the rural places. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Oliver, if you want to come in now.
No, just to comment on the involvement of the private sector. Somebody said at the beginning of the discussion, and I concur with that the private sector is actually already doing quite a few things on the ground concerning the Nexus. SAB Miller, you mentioned it, but other ones as well, even small and medium enterprises are doing it. The issue is to convince them, and it's important for them to become involved in the whole discussion on the SDGs. But they are doing some interesting work, and so that's my answer to the concern about involving the private sector. Thank you.
Vadim?
Thanks. I will start from the private sector. In my opinion, private sector is the engine of sustainable development, and now everything begins from the private sector. It's a locomotive of the changing and of improvement. I think that now we have to focus how to involve private sector in government sustainable development. This is our focus. And about sustainable development. Actually, Nexus is focused on sustainable development, and this is the first step. When we receive our purpose of Nexus resources, of course we receive sustainable development. We will start from the local level, and after the local level, we receive the regional sustainable development. It's like a snowball, step by step. And also it's connecting with political issues. Sustainable development will receive all the questions, because poor people is hungry people. But when we receive a problem with energy and food, where the problem, local problem between the nearest countries? Nothing. We can see the modern situation when one country tried to cut the access to the water to other countries. But it's not the way how to decide the political problem. It's also like a snowball. You start to punish and hit somebody, he will answer you it, and after that we receive the Third World War. It's a terrible situation. That's why we try to start to decide this problem on the local level, from the with the civil society, with the private sector, and after that, civil society and private sector will ask the local government that please help us, and if you help us, we decide not only small local problem, but we decide the global problem, which will start from our country. That's all.
Yeah. Oliver?
So I quickly want to make a clarification. I honestly don't think the private sector is hesitant to engage with the process. if something I have learned throughout this year and even during Rio +20 is that the private sector has been raising their hands, like screaming at the UN, like hear us speak, like we have things to share with you, we have lessons learned, we have technology. Private sector actually controls the technology, and it's the one that is forcing itself to be more innovative and to change the way that they're doing things. If I were to be very honest about this, I do think that there's a hesitation, even from us, from the NGO sector, about engaging the private sector when it comes to sustainable development, particularly in a topic such as sensitive as water, energy, and food. I think there's some historical things that cannot be ignored. And what I would say is that recognizing those constraints, we should think more clearly, particularly going forward on the next stage of the post-2015 discussions, how we can integrate voices more equally. Private sector, civil society, youth, science, technologies, we need all of them to make the Nexus actually happen. And if we recognize that, then we are taking a first step. And then my last comment about water and conflict. Yes, that's absolutely true. But there's another side, which is how I like thinking about water. Water as a peacemaking tool. You can bring people to a table that often don't come together to discuss issues about water management. A great example, and probably my favorite example about this, is the Nile River Basin Committee. You have countries that otherwise wouldn't talk to each other, trying to make decisions about water management, about energy management. And it is a first step to bring those countries into a table. And from that, you can provide already like a forum where you can discuss other topics, gender to some extent, and other development issues to some extent. But it has that, like water does have that capacity. So instead of looking how it can exacerbate conflict, we should also look on the positive way, how it can also provide a tool and a forum for dialogue. And my final remarks is that I'm a 90% cynic, 10% hopeful that the SDGs are actually going to make a difference. That 10% actually relies on them taking aboard like the Nexus approach, because for me, it's very easy. I don't think there's a lot of political opposition about it, and the Nexus can actually make a difference in the way we think about development, because it hits across all sectors. It hits gender, it hits urban development, it hits food production, and I think it has that potential to multiply development or good development.
Thanks. I think that the discussion around the issue of the private sector is important. But, you know, I'm a guy myself as a chair here who supports regulation. If only we'd had regulation on our banks, we might not have been in the mess that we are at this particular time. And so I think that the push by companies like Aviva for having a convention originally around Rio on corporate reporting is really important. And I would suggest, if you're interested in that issue, to go to Stakeholder Forum's website, which links to the coalition that is trying to ensure that out of the SDGs we get a compulsion of all companies listed on stock exchange to have to produce their sustainability report. I think that is a crucial balance to engaging with the private sector. And on the peace issue, and of course I love the Nile example, but we have a peace issue about to come up on that, because Ethiopia is actually building a dam and suggesting that they would like to keep more of the water than they're entitled to in the Nile agreement. And one can imagine where that could go if we're not careful. And I think that goes down to, where has this conversation come from? It came from the leadership that the German government made in 2009, in deciding to hold a conference on the Nexus. and actually putting it on the agenda for the SDGs, I think, has been crucial. And I think, you know, we are now trying to address it before it becomes a problem. And I think there's a lot of work that's being done. We heard from FAO on the work that they're doing, but it's not the only agency and program that's doing that. So I'd ask you to come to the next Nexus conference in 2015. It's the 15th to the 17th at Chapel Hill in North Carolina. And the website is very simple, nexus.unc.edu. Nexus.unc.edu. I'd like you to thank our presenters and our panelists for what I think has been a really interesting talk. And to leave you with a little bit of a challenging quote by Martin Luther King, who said, "Over the bleached bones of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late." Let us not be too late. Have a great day.